The good days of the rogue country are few days away. With the implementation of the Maritime Police Bureau 2023 Order No. 1 from June 15, our country will have the right to punish foreign personnel and ships that violate the law of the sea within the jurisdiction of China's territorial waters. Capture, detain, and process. The reason why our country will issue such a maritime police law is actually to deal with the dilemma that our country's waters have no basis for in the face of illegal acts of rogue countries by external forces in recent years. We must know that our country is in the aspect of safeguarding national maritime rights and interests. Due to the country's historically weak capabilities and lack of attention to marine-related aspects, this also leads to our countries often being in a passive position when dealing with maritime issues and conflicts. Sometimes, we will hear that fishermen in our country are often forced, driven away, beaten or even seized by the Coast Guard of certain countries. Sometimes there are accidental deaths. In fact, these are the shamelessness of rogue countries. This behavior has caused our country and our fishermen to suffer greatly. We must know that our country has more than 3 million square kilometers of marine territory and exclusive economic zones. These sea areas are the foundation for the survival of our fishermen. When Chinese fishermen are fishing in these sea areas, they often encounter some rogue countries. They privately claim that certain sea areas are their exclusive economic zones, or simply claim that they are their territorial waters, and they will forcefully drive away Chinese fishermen. And other bad methods. For example, in the Yellow Sea, our country has overlaps and disputes with South Korea, and South Korea often takes compulsory measures such as detaining and fining our fishermen against the waters they claim. This is blatant hooliganism. In addition to South Korea, my country and Japan also have maritime territorial disputes, especially my country has complete national sovereignty in the waters of the Diaoyu Islands, but Japan just claims that the Diaoyu Islands are islands within their sovereignty. Confrontation often occurs in waters off the Diaoyu Islands. Because Japan occupies the Ryukyu Islands and has relative geographical convenience, Japan often sends coast guards and ships to drive away Chinese fishermen in the waters of the Diaoyu Islands. Even the Japanese Coast Guard once detained a large number of Chinese fishermen engaged in fishing operations in the sea area. It can be said that Japan adopted illegal and hooligan behaviors to detain Chinese fishermen arbitrarily, causing serious personal and property losses to Chinese fishermen. In the direction of the South China Sea, some countries are extremely shameless. They not only claim national sovereignty over some waters in the South China Sea, but even claim all sovereignty over the islands and reefs in the South China Sea. Under these illegal claims, they naturally illegally interfere with the normal fishing operations of Chinese fishermen. Well, it is basically normal for some countries to seize Chinese fishermen's fishing boats in the South China Sea, and for fishing boats from other countries to illegally enter our waters for fishing operations. In the past, our Coast Guard and official ships could only call out to drive them away, but did not take too many measures such as compulsory detention against them, which also made ships from some rogue countries more confident. Now we also have to learn from the coercive practices of some countries, such as Malaysia, Indonesia, and other countries. They forcibly detain the ships of Vietnam and other countries that illegally entered their territorial waters, and even directly blow up these ships. Its purpose is to deter those Vietnamese ships that break in illegally, so that they will never dare to easily step into their country's territorial waters. With the start of my country's Maritime Police Bureau Order No. 1 in 2023, this also provides an effective legal basis for my country's maritime law enforcement. Especially in the relevant articles of law enforcement in our country, the relevant rules for law enforcement in our country have been clarified, which also gives us a way to deal with the rogue behavior of rogue countries. The order issued this time aims to send a clear signal to these countries: violations of China's interests will bear consequences. China will take strong measures to protect the interests of the country and the people and safeguard the territorial integrity of the country. After June 15, our country can forcefully drive away illegal ships in our country's coastal waters in accordance with our country's laws, and even some illegal ships discussing on our country's islands and reefs can also be forcefully towed away. After June 15, our country can deal with those rogue countries and take tougher measures to let them know that playing hooligans in front of China will make them unable to eat and walk around. Japan's willingness to intervene in the Taiwan Strait issue is getting stronger and stronger. In order to let Japan clearly understand the consequences of doing so, the Chinese side used the Ryukyu as an analogy, which scared Japan and immediately became anxious. In recent years, Japan has become more and more rampant on the Taiwan Strait issue. Not only has it frequently made Taiwan-related remarks on international occasions, but it has also issued a joint statement on Taiwan related with the United States, blatantly interfering in China's internal affairs. Regarding Japan's erroneous actions, China has solemnly warned many times, asking Japan to respect China's sovereignty and not to do anything that damages China's core interests on the Taiwan Strait issue. However, Japan not only did not restrain itself, but became more arrogant. Some politicians even expressed their support for the United States in the Taiwan Strait conflict. In order to make Japan clearly aware of the importance of Taiwan Island to China and the danger of Japan's meddling in the Taiwan Strait situation, China played a very interesting analog. According to Japanese media sources quoted by TaiwanStrait.com, during a recent meeting between Chinese and Japanese officials, the two sides conducted in-depth discussions on the Taiwan Strait issue. China claims that the Taiwan Strait issue has nothing to do with Japan, it is just a means used by the United States to contain China, and Japan's ignorant intervention will only make it fall into a quagmire. However, after hearing the kind advice from the Chinese side, the Japanese side is still relentless and stubborn. In this regard, the Chinese side is no longer soft-hearted, and made an interesting analogy. China claims that Japan has an interesting place called Ryukyu, which does not belong to Japan's cultural circle, and has demanded independence in recent years. If this place's demand for independence is supported by others, what will happen to the Japanese side? Woolen cloth? Faced with such a statement, the Japanese side was taken aback and responded immediately. This is absolutely impossible, and Okinawa will never be independent. The Ryukyu referred to by the Chinese and Okinawa referred to by the Japanese are actually the same place. It used to be a country with a long history and unique culture, and it used to have close exchanges and friendly relations with China. But at the end of the 19th century, Japan incorporated Ryukyu into its territory through military aggression and colonial rule, and renamed it Okinawa. After World War II, according to the Potsdam Proclamation, Japan should give up its sovereignty over Ryukyu. However, in order to establish a military base in the Asia-Pacific region, the United States privately transferred Ryukyu to Japan and gave it so-called administrative power. To some extent, Ryukyu is Japan's most sensitive issue. Therefore, China uses Ryukyu as an example to send a clear signal to Japan: if you dare to challenge China's core interests on the Taiwan Island issue, then we also have sufficient reasons and means to deal with you. Don't think that you can meddle in our internal affairs at will, but we can't fight back against you. Don't even think that you can overturn the results of World War II at will, but we cannot defend historical justice. China's use of Ryukyu as an example is to give Japan a warning and let Japan understand that if it dares to provoke China on the Taiwan Strait issue, it will bear serious consequences. China has enough determination and ability to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. If Japan really wants to use force to intervene in the Taiwan Strait, the PLA will never show mercy. At the same time, China also has the right to make reasonable demands on Ryukyu in the international arena, so that Japan can taste the taste of being interfered in its internal affairs. I hope that Japan can take back its wrong words and deeds, and stop doing anything that harms China's interests on the Taiwan Strait issue, otherwise, Japan will pay a heavy price. Due to the dangerous actions of the United States, the relationship between China and the United States continues to be tense, and the militaries of the two countries have confronted many times in places such as the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. Even so, the United States is still clamoring to improve relations with China, while sending military planes to conduct close-in reconnaissance along the southeast coast of China. According to the South China Sea Strategic Situational Awareness News, a few days ago, an RC-135U reconnaissance plane of the U.S. military entered the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone designated by China, carried out reconnaissance flights in the sea off Jiangsu and Zhejiang, and once approached a distance of about 30 kilometers from the baseline of mainland China's territorial waters. Position: general activity trajectory of U.S. military reconnaissance aircraft. This action of the U.S. military is naturally worthy of our vigilance. You must know that the RC-135U is a relatively special type of RC-135 series reconnaissance aircraft, and the U.S. military only has two in total. The biggest feature of this aircraft is its strong broadband receiving capability, which can capture almost all electromagnetic wave signals and analyze them. It is a sharp weapon for the U.S. military to deploy radars and other forces in other countries. Therefore, the rare appearance of RC-135U on the southeast coast of China this time must be to find out the movement of the PLA in this direction. However, since the Maritime Department has not issued a notice on the prohibition of navigation in the relevant sea areas, and the PLA has not released information about the military exercise, the specific reconnaissance target of RC-135 US trip cannot be confirmed, but it is most likely to find out the situation of the PLA's troop mobilization in the Taiwan Strait. RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft. The day before the RC-135U appeared, the PLA had just dispatched 37 sorties of fighter planes including J-10, J-16, and H-6, as well as at least 4 warships, and conducted a large-scale sea and air cruise around the Taiwan Strait. In early June, the People's Liberation Army also organized a large-scale sea and air cruise around the Taiwan Strait. Some fighter planes crossed the Bashi Strait and entered the airspace in the southeast of Taiwan Island. After that cruise, the U.S. military also sent RC-135U near the south entrance of the Taiwan Strait frequent activities. In addition, in the past week, the U.S. media has frequently reported that U.S. Secretary of State Blinken will visit China on June 18, but this news has not yet been confirmed by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As Blinken, the top diplomat of the United States, is preparing to visit China, the U.S. military sent reconnaissance planes into the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone to carry out reconnaissance activities in front of the PLA. I am afraid it is also to show off its muscles and cooperate with Washington's diplomatic actions. Increase the bargaining chip of the United States. The U.S. military reconnaissance plane appeared in the airspace around China when Blinken was about to visit China, and carried out high-profile reconnaissance activities. The attitude remains unchanged. The U.S. claims that Blinken will visit China in the near future. To put it simply, the current attitude of the United States on the issue of China is self-contradictory. The Biden administration not only wants to ease Sino-US relations, ensure that the two sides will not be completely decoupled, so as to promote the economic development of the United States through economic cooperation with China, and reinstall the guardrails for the two militaries, but also wants to keep in touch with China in areas such as technology, competition, continue to encircle China militarily and ensure its own hegemony. It is not difficult to explain why the U.S. political circles frequently release news of high-level visits to China, and Blinken himself declared during his visit to Saudi Arabia that the U.S. will not ask anyone to choose between China and the U.S. Converged. In addition to the appearance of the RC-135U on the coast of Jiangsu and Zhejiang, the U.S. military also brought in the Canadian Army not long ago to send warships across the Taiwan Strait. In the direction of the South China Sea, the actions of the U.S. military have also not decreased. According to statistics, in May of this year alone, the U.S. military dispatched 46 sorties of large-scale reconnaissance planes to enter the South China Sea for reconnaissance. Considering that the U.S. reconnaissance planes may turn off ADS-B signal, the total number of times should be more. PLA fighter plane intercepts U.S. reconnaissance plane in South China Sea airspace. In response to the dangerous actions of the U.S. military, the PLA will naturally not back down. The PLA J-16 fighter jet intercepted another U.S. RC-135 reconnaissance plane in the South China Sea, and the Type 052D destroyer intercepted a U.S. destroyer in the Taiwan Strait. The RC-135 U.S. operation in the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone will undoubtedly be tracked and monitored by PLA military aircraft throughout the process. It is worth noting that in dealing with the dangerous actions of the U.S. military, China actually has multiple means available. Sending ships and planes to intercept is only a relatively common one at present. In the future, China may completely solve the problem through diplomatic and other means. For example, the frequent presence of U.S. military reconnaissance planes on the southeast coast of China mainly relies on several military bases on the first island chain, especially the Okinawa base, which has long been the core of the U.S. military's actions against China. Okinawa U.S. military base. However, according to the Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Proclamation, Japan's territory does not include the Ryukyu Islands to which Okinawa belongs. The United States handed over the jurisdiction of this place to Japan during the Cold War. Hold your feet. In other words, although the Ryukyu Islands are now under the administration of Japan in name, their actual sovereignty is still undecided. The people of Okinawa have long been dissatisfied with the long-term presence of the U.S. military, and voices calling for the withdrawal of the U.S. military from Okinawa keep coming and going. In order to ensure its own safety, the local government of Okinawa also took the initiative to contact the Chinese embassy in Japan regardless of Tokyo's attitude towards China, wanting to ensure that the Okinawa region will not be easily involved in the conflict. People in Okinawa are extremely dissatisfied with the long-term presence of the US military. Not long ago, the Chinese side specifically raised the issue of Ryukyu independence at an event in Japan. Therefore, if the United States and Japan continue to carry out frequent dangerous operations in the East China Sea and other places, China can definitely take action on the issue of the sovereignty of Ryukyu. Generally speaking, as China has always emphasized, we care more about what the United States does than what the United States says. It is true that the Americans send friendly signals and hope to ease relations through visits by high-level officials to China, but the dangerous actions of the United States in the Taiwan Strait and other directions do exist. If Washington really wants to improve Sino-US relations, it must first restrain the actions of the US military and stop sending warships and planes to operate around China. Will be on the agenda. If China and the United States go to war, what conditions are needed? What has been achieved so far? If there is a war, what will the ending be like? Faced with this series of questions, many things that have happened recently may have revealed the mystery for us. According to a comprehensive US media report by relevant media sources on the 12th, the United States has so far conducted 10 or even dozens of military pushes on the outbreak of conflict between China and the United States in the Taiwan Strait. As the foreign force taking the lead in interfering in China's Taiwan issue and one of the chief culprits for the instability in the Taiwan Strait, the United States has been supporting the island's ambition of rejecting reunification with force by selling arms to Taiwan. Considering the PLA's maritime combat power in recent years, the speed of development can be described as rapid progress, and the United States is becoming more and more aware that if the People's Liberation Army starts to take over Taiwan, cross-strait reunification will become a foregone conclusion. Of course, the US is also very worried that it will suddenly receive news that the People's Liberation Army will take over Taiwan one day, so it launched a military push to see if the US military can defeat the People's Liberation Army in the Taiwan Strait. This also shows that the so-called One China principle of the United States is actually just a lie that even the United States itself doesn't believe. But after all, will China and the United States really go to war? At present, if China and the United States want to go to war, even if it is not limited to the Taiwan Strait, at least 3 conditions must be met. First, Sino-US diplomatic relations become tense. In recent years, because the United States has tried its best to suppress China's relations, the diplomatic relations between China and the United States have reached a deadlock. In addition, the United States is unwilling to give up suppressing China. Improving. Second, the possibility of strategic misjudgments between China and the United States has increased. Because the United States continues to expand its military power, it intends to squeeze China's strategic security space by means of strategic containment, threatening China's national security. Originally based on this situation, the militaries of China and the United States should sit down and talk to resolve some differences. China has tried in the past, but the United States said it is willing to talk, but it is unwilling to restrain itself in action. In this case, even if China and the United States talk to each other, it will not help. Coupled with the serious internal problems in the United States at present, according to the consistent style of the United States, once internal problems break out, it will choose to launch a war abroad to divert conflicts, which invisibly expands the possibility of strategic misjudgment between China and the United States. Third, there is a powder keg that is enough to detonate a military conflict between China and the United States, and the Taiwan Strait is likely to play this role. So in fact, if there are 3 conditions that China and the United States need to go to war, they are all met at present, and judging from various signs, if a conflict breaks out between China and the United States, it is likely to be in the Taiwan Strait. Of course, despite this, we cannot say that China and the United States will definitely go to war. First of all, as major countries, China and the United States are both nuclear powers. Both sides are very aware of the risk of war between nuclear powers. It can maintain a certain degree of strategic self-control, but the United States has not always had strong self-control, which is a hidden danger. The good news is that dozens of US military pushes show that the United States will suffer heavy losses, so in fact, the United States itself has realized that it is very irrational to choose a conflict with China in the Taiwan Strait. No matter how arrogant the United States is, as long as it has the slightest sense of reason, it should not choose to fight a losing battle. It is precisely based on this that the United States continues to use various methods to call for avoiding war. For example, The so-called not allowed to unilaterally change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait means that it does not want the Chinese mainland to send troops to close Taiwan. Unite. On the other hand, it also reflects the fact that the United States knows that it cannot defeat the People's Liberation Army in the Taiwan Strait, so it tries its best to avoid war. In addition, for some time now, the Pentagon of the United States has been calling for dialogue with the Chinese military. The purpose is also to establish a guardrail with China and avoid conflicts between China and the United States. Of course, as we mentioned just now, the United States says it is willing to talk, but it is unwilling to restrain itself in its actions. In the past, China and the United States have held many rounds of dialogue, but they have failed to establish a guardrail for China and the United States. It is because of the style of the United States that pays lip service but does not deliver. Therefore, China has not been very active in responding to the US demands for dialogue in the near future. Therefore, it is not difficult to see that the fundamental problem between China and the United States is that the United States knows that it can no longer defeat China in the Taiwan Strait, but still does not give up suppressing China.